the civil rights movement before and after the Brown decision, and we will eventually evaluate whether or not the Brown decision was a turning point in the civil rights movement. So if we look at what was going on prior to the Brown case in 1954, which ended segregation in public schools, we see that there was some chipping away at the Plessy case. And just as a reminder, we have Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 that ruled that racial segregation in public facilities did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so that gave the go-ahead for all of the states to just kind of implement segregation on a widespread basis. And so there were some cases earlier that we should look to if we're trying to evaluate if Brown was a turning point. So I gave you kind of the history here. And if we were in class together, we would read through these cases just to kind of point out some of the big ones. Like we talked about Dred Scott, in that case was a major factor in causing the Civil War. The Slaughterhouse cases, which undermined the meaning of the 14th Amendment. The civil rights cases in 1883 saying that the 14th Amendment does not prohibit discrimination by private individuals or businesses. And of course, there's Plessy, and then some later cases talking about public schools are under state regulation, so the federal government cannot regulate them. Private schools must abide by segregation laws of each state. So that's upholding segregation. Also, 1927 is the right of states to define and enforce racial classifications for educational purposes. Then we see a little bit of a change at the Maryland Supreme Court level, that they ruled that a black student must be admitted to the state's all-white school. Okay, a law school. Okay, so this was because there were no other law schools available, and that was in 1936. So this is a step forward, but it's at the state level. Then we see the Supreme Court ordering black student admittance to Missouri all-white law school. Okay, so this is reinforcing this earlier case at the federal level. Sweat versus Painter, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal schools were unattainable. So this is an acknowledgement that the idea of separation never being able to be equal because it implies inferiority. And then this 1950 case of McLaurin v. Oklahoma, the Supreme Court ruled that a public institution of higher learning could not provide different treatment to a student solely because of his or her race. Okay, so these are steps in the civil rights movement. And then we have the Brown case, and I just kind of laid this out in a very simplified manner. We have state laws segregating schools for African Americans, and the issue was, do these state schools violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? And the decision was yes, it's inherently unequal separation and will stigmatize children, and it does violate the Equal Protection Clause. And all state laws requiring separation of races in public schools are unconstitutional. So that was the effect of this case. It was a bombshell because all of the state laws that were in place now had to be removed, and the southern states did not like this. And so they organized against it. And this plan is known collectively as massive resistance. And so we see at the federal level, members of the Congress signed the Southern Manifesto. So 19 U.S. senators and 82 House members were all Democrats from the South. They signed this pledge saying that the Brown case was unconstitutional. It abused judicial power. It violated states' rights. There's no mention of education in the Constitution or in the 14th Amendment, so it was inappropriate for the Supreme Court to interfere. And if you think back to some of the earlier logic of the Supreme Court in some of these cases that we talked about, here we see that idea that this is education is a reserve power, the state should control it. And so the Southern states are hanging on to that idea. And it urged Southerners, the Southern Manifesto, to exhaust all lawful means to resist the chaos and confusion that would result from school desegregation. Next, we move on to Virginia. The General Assembly in Virginia adopted a policy of massive resistance, using the law and the courts to obstruct desegregation. In 1958, the governor closed schools in counties in Virginia rather than allow them to desegregate. The following year, states and federal courts invalidated Virginia's massive resistance statutes, but public schools in Prince Edward County, where the Virginia case against segregated schools had originally been filed, remained closed for 5 years as some white Virginians fought desegregation of schools. So this kind of went on for years and years, people just resisting the idea. And I don't know if you ever read the story of Ruby Bridges when you were little, but she was a little girl, an African-American girl who went to school in 5th grade, and all of the white families kept their children home because she was going. And so she sat in the room alone with the school teacher. And that went on for a long time, and then eventually the white families caved. But think about the bravery of that little girl going to school alone like that. It's so crazy. Okay, moving on to the story of Arkansas and the Little Rock Nine. This is a really, really famous story. The governor of Arkansas enlisted the National Guard, those are the state's soldiers, to prevent the African American kids from going to high school. And they showed up with weapons to protect the school. And so we have a crowd of 400 whites jeering, booing, and threatening to lynch the African American teenagers who ran away. And this is all in violation of the federal order to integrate the school. So after the governor surrounded the school with the Arkansas National troops, there was a showdown between the federal officials and the state. And this is an example of a conflict over federalism because the state was ignoring the Supreme Court order. So the president brought in troops, this is President Eisenhower, and he brought in troops to enforce the federal order. And so the school, the students, African-American students, were allowed to eventually enter the school, but they were surrounded by U.S. troops in order to do that. And so that went on for months and months, that the only way these African-American kids could get into the school was to be escorted by federal troops. And so in class, normally we have this picture on this story, and we read the story about the kids who actually did this, the bravery that they gathered to do something like this. And I ask you to draw a thought bubble over her head and a thought bubble over her head and, describe what they were thinking. And so that's an interesting conversation if you think about that. This is a really famous shot. Okay, in Alabama, we see the Alabama representative coming up with a scheme to continue segregation without, quote unquote, violating the federal order by the Supreme Court. So they created free schools where everybody could attend, but then they created segregated tuition-based schools. So these are state-run tuition-based schools. Bizarre. And white students could stay in the whites-only school by paying a nominal fee, and that fee could be waived if the white student demonstrated financial need. So this is going to maintain the system of segregation even after Brown. Okay, so then where do we go from here? Now, obviously, I was supposed to give you a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., which I didn't, so I apologize to the 4 people who are listening to this, and I appreciate you so much. But, I had a quote from the very famous speech, "I have a dream, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that one day the nation will rise up and live up to this idea, this creed. And so what is King's dream? That the country will live up to its founding principles and treat people equally, that people will no longer be judged by their skin color, but by their actions. And he suggests that we can attain this dream by having people in it together, that people should work together, pray together, struggle together, go to jail together, and stand up for freedom together. And that will break down the barriers between the races. And then this quote, which you may have read if you're taking AP Lit. I know usually the students do read this, some of this at least, Letters from a Birmingham Jail. And this is really heartbreaking when he says, how do you explain to your 5-year-old son, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? And so this is the literature coming out of the civil rights movement. And then I kind of asked you to think about, if you were living at this time, would this make you more or less likely to support King's views? I think it's kind of hard to ignore this language, but that's just me. Okay, and then this is also something where I really didn't give you the reading on, so I apologize, but if you wanted to, you could look this up in the book or on the internet. Some ideas of Malcolm X. This was the homework reading that I never had a chance to give you. So Malcolm X advocated the separation of black and white Americans. The mainstream idea of desegregation was unattainable because whites will never accept blacks. So we should stop striving for that. He argued for black empowerment. He claimed that violence is necessary to counter the violence of white society as a means of self-defense. So he didn't advocate violence in and of itself, just to meet the violence of white society. And he was kind of referring to police violence against African Americans. He adopted the name X because he rejected his name as a slave name, saying that he didn't know his real family name from Africa because his family was kidnapped from Africa. Okay, and going on to our final question, can the Brown case be seen as a turning point? Now, you could really argue both ways. Okay, I argued in this example that it was a turning point, and I have my message here, and I'll read it to you. The Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954 can be seen as a turning point in the civil rights movement. By declaring segregation of public schools to be a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, the Supreme Court invalidated state segregation laws all across the South, forcing the issue of segregation and equality to the forefront of national discussion. While this clearly did not end bigotry and discrimination, the end of legal support for school segregation did send a message to groups on both sides of the civil rights divide. For civil rights leaders and activists, the Brown decision gave them momentum to continue to fight, leading to other gains, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, ending segregation in public places, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where African Americans finally attained the right to vote. For segregationists, the Brown case meant that the federal government was starting to acknowledge the true meaning of equal protection, and that it would use its power to protect individuals from state discrimination. This decision brought these conflicts to the front and center of the countrywide debate, forcing the nation to change. Okay, so I framed it as a turning point. You could also argue that it's not a turning point, and to make that argument, you could point to, let's go back to our earlier cases here, you could say that the Supreme Court had been chipping away slowly at the idea of segregation, and that even after this case, there was so much work to be done in terms of making progress towards civil rights because of all of these examples where the states and even the federal government with the Southern Manifesto resisted this, and we still had so much more to fight about with respect to, let's say, the sit-ins and Rosa Parks' bus boycott and the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his speech, and people resisting violence from the police, like Malcolm X. So you could really point to a lot of things, and even discrimination today with the Black Lives Matter movement would be something that would say that this was not necessarily a turning point. Okay, so that ends our discussion. I hope this was helpful. I miss you. Be well and healthy.